Hello, welcome back to my channel. Happy New Year. Hope your January, however much of it has passed by the time I get this video up, has gone well. Today, what I'm doing for sort of my wrap up for the year is I'm going to be reviewing every book I read in 2022, all 69 of them. I'm going to be reviewing each of them in like one sentence or thereabouts. This is not an original idea with me. If you're familiar with the booktuber Jack Edwards, he's the first person that I saw do this. So I will put a link to his channel or one of those videos in the description. He has a very different taste in books and I think very different perspectives on a lot of things, but he is a very entertaining booktuber. A lot of these are audiobooks, so I don't necessarily have a physical copy, but I will throw up an image of the book cover as well as the star rating that I gave the book, which I won't necessarily say out loud, but it will be here on the screen. So the first book that I read in 2022 was Magpie Murders by Anthony Horowitz, which I thought was an adequate mystery with kind of like a fun book within a book structure, but ultimately I was kind of disappointed by the ending. Speaker for the Dead by Orson Scott Card starts out as a sequel to Ender's Game that I was really excited about, seemed really promising, but then it got weird about halfway through and just really didn't end up delivering. More about that in this video here that I did last year. The next book I listened to in 2022 was Atomic Habits, an easy and proven way to build good habits and break bad ones by James Clear. This is a self-help book that I read in January and honestly forgot most of by March. But my main takeaway from it was that every decision you make, every choice you make is sort of a vote for the kind of person that you want to become, which is maybe a helpful idea. A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith is just a beautiful and honest and heart-rending story about a girl growing up in early 1900s Brooklyn in poverty and how she sort of falls in love with learning and literature. Next we have Elemino P, which I love despite the fact that it has a fish on the cover and I hate fish. They're disgusting. Thank you very much. That's not the review. That's not the review. Elemino P, a novel in letters by Mark Dunn. Come for the quirky premise and structure, stay for the commentary on government overreach. Next audiobook I listened to was Delaire's Book of Greek Myths, which is a fun little introduction to Greek myth if you don't mind a little bit of sanitization of some parts for the sake of the younger target audience. The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden initially sucked me in with its lush prose and historical Russian setting, but then spit me right back out with its pro-demon, anti-Christian rhetoric and a really disappointing ending. Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata is not the fun, quirky little book you may have been expecting from the cover or from some of the reviews you've heard, but it is real and painful and worth a read. No One Will Miss Her by Kat Rosenfield is a decent enough thriller about an influencer and a small-town pariah that kept me engaged on audio. I reread all of Jane Austen's novels with a friend this year, so those are sprinkled throughout this review session. The first one I read is Sense and Sensibility. Sense and Sensibility is one of my least favorite Jane Austen novels because the romantic pairings are not stellar. They're not. But it is still an excellent story about family and about sisters in particular. Empire of Pain, The Secret History of the Sackler Dynasty by Patrick Radden Keefe is a fascinating and infuriating journalistic nonfiction account of the Sackler family who's responsible for the creation of OxyContin, which has been one of the major contributors to the opioid crisis. Yinka, Where Is Your Husband by Lizzie Damalola Blackburn is a terrible rom-com about a train wreck of a woman whose whole thing is that she actually has standards, except maybe she doesn't. The Maltese Falcon by Dashiell Hammett is an overrated sack full of bland writing, intolerable characters, and uninteresting plot. The Taking of Jemima Boone, The True Story of the Kidnap and Rescue That Shaped America by Matthew Pearl is an interesting little history of an event that I didn't know anything about that kept me engaged for the 3 days that it took for me to listen to it on audio. The Golden Tresses of the Dead by Ellen Bradley made me sad because it's the last Flavia de Luce novel and now I have no more Flavia de Luce novels to read. Why Didn't They Ask Evans is one of the most charming Agatha Christie novels I have ever read because I really enjoyed the young and buoyantly optimistic amateur detectives that were at the center of the story. Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen remains an absolute masterpiece of mockery of the ridiculous, balanced with hope in the possibility of reconciliation and harmony between the reasonably rational. The Ambassadors by Henry James is nearly unreadable and certainly unenjoyable. Murder on the Links by Agatha Christie is a fun enough little mystery, but Poirot and Hastings really are not my favorite Christie characters. Longbourn by Jo Baker is a really well-written and fascinating take on Pride and Prejudice, focusing on the household staff that I think is very enjoyable if you can handle the author taking some liberties with some of Austen's most beloved characters. Last Night in Montreal is the haunting, absorbing mystery that should have put Emily St. John Mandel on mine and other people's radar before Station 11 did. Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen is just probably the most fun, goofiest Austen novel there is, and I love it. The Reading List by Sarah Nisha Adams is the book about books that I did not expect to take such a dark turn, and that I also really didn't expect to give 5 stars, but here we are. Secret Identity by Alex Segura is a mystery that's interesting because of its setting in the 1970s world of comics publishing, but tedious in its overwrought identity politics. Okay, The Lightning Thief, The Sea of Monsters, and The Titan's Curse by Rick Riordan are reasonably entertaining middle grade stories, even if they are a little bit mired in typical children's fantasy tropes. But Riordan really lost me with The Battle of the Labyrinth, no pun intended. His smug attempt to convert classical mythology into just palatable liberal mush just got to be too much for me at that point, and that's where I ended up leaving the series. Macbeth is a great play, but this is not a great graphic novel. The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath wins the award for just the most consistently stunning similes in any novel ever. Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt is a sweet little story that's somewhat marred by Cameron being such an annoying brat despite the fact that he's a 30-year-old man. Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr is just an absolute world of a novel of beauty and pain that's about children across time and space who for one reason or another find themselves on the outskirts of their society. The Curious Case of the Copper Corpse, a Flavia de Luce story by Ellen Bradley, made me even sadder because this is the absolute last bit of Flavia de Luce that I had not read before, and I miss Bishop's Lacey. Sea of Tranquility is the disappointment I didn't see coming from Emily St. John Mandel after Station 11 and The Glass Hotel and Last Night in Montreal. Mansfield Park is the Jane Austen novel that continues to surprise me with its compassion and complexity, despite the fact that, like Sense and Sensibility, it has a subpar romantic pairing. Under the Banner of Heaven by John Krakauer is an eye-opening, if maybe a little bit incongruous mashup of true crime and the history of Mormonism that I did find was maybe a little bit hampered by the author's prejudice against religion. The Maid by Nita Prose is the most overrated mystery of the year, with an ending that manages to be absolutely horrendous in 2 completely separate ways. Cult Classic by Sloane Crosley has a pretty interesting premise and a pretty annoying amoral protagonist. The Guest List by Lucy Foley had a good, if not particularly original premise, but the ending made it one of the least satisfying mysteries I have ever had the displeasure of reading. In contrast, The Butterfly House by Katrine Engberg is a perfect Danish crime novel that manages to surpass its also excellent predecessor, The Tenant. The new X-Men Omnibus had some good stuff in it, but it kind of lost me towards the end of this absolute beast of a collection. Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones is maybe the most charming and delightful and just truly pleasantly surprising novel I read this year. The Keeper of Lost Causes by Jussi Alder Olsen is another fantastic Danish crime novel with entertaining characters and nail-biting tension. Mary Jane by Jessica Anya Blau is a thought-provoking story about a sheltered 14-year-old girl who, while nannying for the summer, is exposed to the world of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and I had really mixed feelings about it. Seventh Son is another Orson Scott Card novel that started out with a really fascinating world and well-developed characters, but didn't really end up delivering much plot in the end. The Harbor is Katrine Engberg's kind of disappointing follow-up to The Butterfly House, which must have been a hard act to follow. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe is a moving Christian classic about slavery prior to the American Civil War that is well worth a read, in spite of its somewhat unnecessary length and flaws in plot structure. Tom's Midnight Garden is an adaptation of Philippa Pierce's classic novel that I listened to, and it was fine, but nothing to write home about. There's a joke for the 0.5% of you who have read this book. Jodie Smith's The 101 Dalmatians is a charming little story despite some weird gender stereotyping. The Lost World by Michael Crichton is maybe the most underrated and overhated novel that I read this year. Say Nothing, a true story of murder and memory in Northern Ireland by Patrick Radden Keefe, wasn't as interesting to me as Keefe's other book, Empire of Pain, that I listened to this year, but it still was pretty fascinating and helped me understand the Troubles a little bit better. Halloween Party by Agatha Christie is not really that Halloween-y, but it is one of the best Poirot novels I've read so far. My Man Jeeves by P.G. Wodehouse is a disappointingly repetitive collection that did make me laugh sometimes, but did not live up to the hype. This Is Where You Belong, Finding Home Wherever You Are by Melody Warnick took me forever and ever and ever to read, and was fine, but not particularly groundbreaking. The Guide by Peter Heller is a pretty average thriller that you absolutely should not read until you have read The River, unless you want The River to be 100% spoiled for you. That's what I learned. Delilah Dirk and the King's Shilling and Delilah Dirk and the Pillars of Hercules by Tony Cliff are okay graphic novels if you're looking for something light with a female protagonist, but I was kind of hoping for more from this series that these books didn't really deliver. Elantris by Brandon Sanderson is a really engaging fantasy with fun characters and lots of political and religious intrigue that just didn't quite make it to 5 stars for me because some of the writing was a little bit immature. Emma by Jane Austen is maybe the cringiest of the Austen novels, but still very fun and very funny. Finley Donovan is Killing It by El Cosimano is a funny, lighthearted mystery meets romance that I absolutely devoured on audio in 3 days. I didn't find Finley Donovan Knocks Him Dead quite as charming, but I still enjoyed it. Martian Manhunter Identity has an unusual art style that I didn't always like, but as comics go, it is pretty emotionally compelling. The Emperor's Soul by Brandon Sanderson is a novella set in the same world as Elantris, but I found it pretty disappointing compared to that novel, mostly because the characters just weren't very entertaining or enjoyable or likable. The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro is a really slow novel that I ended up liking better in print than on audio, but when I did finally kind of commit to it, I did end up really enjoying this exploration of kind of choices of loyalty and dignity and where they lead. Piranesi by Susanna Clarke didn't end up surprising me much in terms of plot, but it does have one of the most absolutely entrancing and memorable settings that I've ever read. Persuasion by Jane Austen is the pinnacle expression of rational adult angst. The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson started out wonderfully with cozy adventure vibes and beautiful sort of Bradbury-esque writing, but then descended into uncomfortable madness that I just didn't particularly enjoy. Heroes in Crisis is an intriguing and emotional mystery with some of the best artwork in comics. And finally, the last book I read in 2022 was The Professor by Charlotte Bronte, which did take me back to other classics that I have read and enjoyed, but ultimately has a pretty insufferable protagonist and does not stand up to Jane Eyre, regardless of what Charlotte Bronte thought. And that's it. Those are the 69 books that I read in 2022. Really hoping to hit the even 70 at least this year. I would love to hear what you read and enjoyed or hated. Love the hate. Can't get enough of the hate. In 2022. So let me know in the comments below. And that's it. We'll see you next time.